Good morning, and thank you for coming to the Indiana Farm Equipment and Technology Expo. I'm Eric Pfeiffer from Hoosier Ag Today. We welcome those in attendance. We welcome those live streaming on our Facebook page and on our YouTube channel. We appreciate you being here today. If you're not here, though, you really need to make your way here. We're at Westfield's Grand Park, a new location this year. Tons of stuff going around. We've got a sold-out exhibitor floor, so come on down to the show. Today is the last day to come check everything out. And it's a bit rainy out there. I don't think you're going to get much work done today, so come on out this way. We would really appreciate it. We also have a free drone giveaway. If you see these signs, we've got one over here in the corner. See these signs around here? Just take out your camera on your smartphone and act like you're taking a picture of that code over there. It'll take you to a website, and you can sign up to receive a free drone from this year's show, so be sure to check that out as well. We have a great seminar lineup today. Coming up a little bit later on, we're going to be doing the Soil Health Podcast recording. It's a regular podcast we do from Hoosier Ag Today, but we'll be doing it live in person, taking your questions. And we'll also do the Purdue Crop Chat podcast. Dan Quinn and Sean Castile with Purdue Extension, they'll be on the stage later, and I hope you come and just absolutely pepper them with questions, especially if we can find some that they can't answer. That would be fantastic for me. I would love that. So come on down to the show. We would love to see you. Up now, we're going to get the facts about carbon credits with Todd Janzen. He's an ag attorney, and he knows all about this stuff. And Todd, the session starts with 8 minutes of your stand-up, right? Sure. That was in the contract. You didn't read it? You're a lawyer, after all. Come on, man.
Thank you. I can't promise any laughs, but I can stand up here for 8 minutes. That's not a problem. Well, thank you, Hoosier Ag Today, for inviting me here today. And I am a lawyer, as he mentioned, and I work with farmers and agribusiness and ag tech companies. And I really enjoy the work that I do. It's great. I grew up on a farm in Kansas, and so this is a great way to connect my rural background with my career as an attorney. So if you could go to the first slide. Today I'm going to talk about carbon credits and also specifically soil carbon contracts. I already mentioned a little bit about myself. I would also say, you can go ahead and go to the next slide. My upbringing, I grew up in south central Kansas on a farm there, and beef cattle, grain, livestock, you name it, a little bit of everything. After I went to law school, I started working with a lot of farmers, and I realized that there was a real need for farmers to have legal representation that wasn't being served by the legal industry. And so I sort of set out on a career path to say, let's build a practice in agricultural law, and let's just focus on farmers and ag tech and so on. I was just reminded this morning, I'm here to talk about carbon and carbon credits, and you know, when you're my age, nope, might need to, is the mic? Thank you. Okay, I'm back. Okay, as I was saying, you know, when you're my age, somewhere in your 40s, and you go home to visit your parents, your mom always gives you a box of stuff that she finds that is your stuff that she's ready to get out of the house. And in the last box she gave me when I went to visit my parents, there was a stack of high school speeches. And, you know, without dating myself, I was a high schooler in the 80s. And one of those speeches when I was a freshman was about global warming. And so it dawned on me, wow, we've been talking about this topic for a long time. But it's not until really 2021, I'd say, is the first year where we've really seen farmers starting to get paid for doing things about addressing the issues with respect to global warming and climate change. So that's what I'm going to talk about now. If you want to go to the next slide, here's our agenda for today's talk. I really want to focus on soil carbon contracts because that's a really hot topic right now in agricultural law and for you all as row crop farmers. Soil carbon contracts are appearing on the farm from various sources from different companies who are offering to pay farmers to sequester soil or sequester carbon in their soil. And it's a very interesting thing, a concept from a legal construct. And so we'll get into the nuts and bolts there and talk about what those contracts are all about, and then sort of end with asking the question, should you sign up for one of these programs in 2022? So let's go to the next slide. Before we get into the weeds too far, let's start with some soil carbon basics. So carbon is a ubiquitous element, right? It's everywhere in the atmosphere. It's everywhere in almost anything that we see out here in the world. Carbon is everywhere, right? It's one of the most ubiquitous molecules in the world. As far as carbon goes and soil, the way that it works, it's a beautiful cycle, right? We have carbon dioxide in the air. As you grow corn, soybeans, any plants, that photosynthesis pulls that carbon dioxide out of the air, and it puts that carbon then into different forms, such as grain, plant material, and also in the roots into the soil. And so as that plant then biodegrades, that carbon is eventually re-released as CO2 back into the atmosphere again. And it's a beautiful cycle, right? The idea of a soil carbon contract is that, is there something that we can do on the farm that allows for more carbon to be pulled out of the atmosphere and stored long-term in the soil? It's a form of carbon sequestration, right? So how can we farm a little bit differently so that you can get more CO2 permanently stuck in that soil, or more carbon stuck in that soil? And if you go to the next slide, this is how a soil carbon contract works in general. And if we were telling a story, I'd say the story really starts with the far right side of the screen here with your carbon buyers. McDonald's is an example, PepsiCo, virtually any large multinational corporation today, or even just national corporation. You go to their website, you're going to find a section on what they are doing to address climate change. And it's there, it's everywhere because Wall Street wants it, shareholders want it. And so these companies have all pledged, we are going to reduce our carbon footprint by 2030 by a certain benchmark, by 2040 for a certain benchmark, by 2050. Hopefully they'll reach the holy grail of being net zero. So they produce no more emissions than they are, putting out there in the environment. And so, hopefully these companies get to that point. But so your McDonald's, we'll use them as an example here. McDonald's has already classified the amount of emissions that it takes to put hamburgers on store shelves or on McDonald's counters across the world, right? And they know what that number is. And so they are trying to figure out, how do we reduce our carbon footprint? How do we shrink that number, the amount of emissions that we produce to put hamburgers on the counter? And so the way that they do that is they think, well, one way we can achieve this would be to pay somebody else to reduce their carbon footprint, their sequester more carbon either in the ground or some other way, reduce their emissions. And if we're paying them to do that, we should get the credit for it. And that's the whole concept of the carbon credit. There are 4 parties in these soil carbon contracts, and you see them all here on the screen. You've got your carbon buyers on the one end. The tool that they use, the vehicle, is a carbon credit, and I'll talk about that in a second. But on the other end of the spectrum here, we have the farmer. So the farmer is the one, you all in the audience, the one that actually does the work to try to get more carbon stored in that soil for a long term. If the farmer can do this, if you're able to generate enough or pull enough carbon out of the atmosphere stored in the soil, in theory, you could sell that carbon credit, that offset, to a company like McDonald's. But to do that, you need these intermediaries here. One example here, we have brokers, right? So the broker is usually the company that facilitates the transaction between your carbon credit buyers and your farmers who are doing the work to sequester that carbon. But the broker themselves can't do this all by themselves. They also require another party, which I call the verifier here. The verifier is the company that creates the protocols that says, we've done the science, we figured out this is what a farmer needs to do in order to sequester carbon in that soil, to increase the carbon uptake in that soil. And so it's not all left to the brokers, and they have to rely on these verifiers. So there's two big arrows on the screen here. Um, at the bottom, we see the carbon credits flowing from the broker back to the carbon credit buyers. And on the top, we see the financial transaction, the money flowing back down to the broker, the payment for that carbon credit. And then presumably the farmer also makes some money from that transaction. Well, if you go to the next slide, let me talk for a minute about what a carbon credit actually is. So a carbon credit is just really a unit of measurement. It's a way that we can measure how much carbon we're able to pull out of the atmosphere and sequester or offset from an emission standpoint. The unit of measure here that is used universally is a carbon credit equals 1 metric ton of carbon dioxide or its equivalent. So if you're talking about a different gas, it's a different number. But for carbon dioxide, which is important to you all as farmers or as any of us that breathe or grow plants, carbon dioxide, 1 metric ton of that is about 2,300 pounds in US pounds. So think of it as I Googled here. I said, what car weighs about 2,300 pounds? The Fiat 500 was the example that came up. So this car weighs about the same amount as 1 metric ton of carbon dioxide. And if you go to the next slide, here's a representation of what that actually looks like as far as volume goes. So it's quite a bit, right? 1 metric ton of carbon dioxide. Interestingly enough, I was curious, how much carbon dioxide does a vehicle produce in the average year, right? How many of these cubes? And let me ask the audience, does anyone have a guess how many, an average vehicle, how many carbon or metric tons of CO2 an average vehicle produces in a year? 10? Oh, not too far off. Actually, the EPA says it's 4.6. So that's the average. And I'm sure, you can imagine a truck going down the highway probably is a little higher, of course, and a small car like that Fiat is probably quite a bit lower. But 4.6, right? So think about that. Okay, if you want to go to the next slide. When we talk about carbon credits, there is already a marketplace out there that's happening, and it's still, I'd say, an infant at this point. But I have here, this is a slide from a Farm Journal article that was out earlier in the year, where it mentioned all of what I'll call the ecosystem services brokers. So these are all the carbon credit brokers that are out there, and there are quite a few more already than were on this slide. But some of the examples, Bayer, ESMC, which is the Ecosystem Services Market Consortium, Farmers Business Network, Indigo's Carbon Program, many of you have heard of that, Nori and Nutrien, but there are many others out there. But these are all companies or organizations, consortiums that have said, we want to facilitate those transactions between our carbon credit buyers and the farmers who are willing to farm a little bit differently in order to put more carbon into the soil. Next slide, please. All right, so now let's talk about the key elements of these carbon contracts. And I'm sure many of you have probably already been given these by one of these companies who might have made an offer to you to sequester carbon on your farm. But let's talk about some of these specifics. I've looked at many of these contracts, and I've even helped some companies with drafting these soil carbon contracts. And so I tried to digest, what are all the key components and what makes these contracts unique. They're not just typical farm contracts like a lease or something like that. They're very unique. And so let's talk about some of the key components that we have in all of these contracts. The first thing that you'll see in these contracts is an enrollment of land. And so you'll have to sign up a certain number of acres and commit those acres to follow this company's, whichever one you choose, their protocols. So the enrollment of land, from my standpoint, is kind of interesting because normally with any sort of contract involving land, if it's for long term, you're going to record it. Now, as a lawyer, we're often telling farmers you need to record your lease with whoever you're renting land from, but I know not everyone does this, but you should, because that protects you in the event that land is sold if you have a long-term lease and somebody can't sell it out from under you. These contracts, the enrollment of land, are usually long-term, because if you think about that growing corn plant and the carbon cycle, if you are putting more carbon in the soil one year, you want to make sure it stays there for the long term. And so companies usually aren't willing to do this on a 1 or 2 year basis. They want 5, 10, 15 years because they want to make sure that that carbon is locked into the soil for many years to come. All right, next slide. The next component to a carbon soil contract are the mandated farming practices or the farming protocols. And so this is also very interesting because probably the most ideal farm for a lot of these programs would be one that's been conventional tillage for years and years and years and very vigorously tilled. And now these companies would be happy to pay somebody to convert to no-till and to a cover cropping system because those two practices have been proven, or I'd say not by me. I'm not the soil scientist here. We'll let the NRCS people talk about that. But those two ways of farming have shown that they can increase the carbon that is stored in the long term in the soil. And so if you were to convert conventional till to no-till and cover cropping, you would have the ability to pull more CO2 out of the atmosphere from year to year to year. And I also understand it's sort of a decreasing radius here. So you may pull out the most that first year and more the second year and so on. But ultimately, in the long term, that window gets smaller and smaller. So you're probably generating fewer carbon credits. Also, limited fertilizer usage, that may be a way because the energy that goes into producing commercial fertilizers is quite a bit. One unique thing that I've seen in these contracts is that they're a lot like website terms and conditions that we all face when we log on to websites and they say, our privacy policies changed, our terms have changed, right? If you want to use this site, you have to accept this. These two may change over the course of 10 years, and most contracts will have some sort of reopener that will say, we're not just asking you to commit to do cover cropping and no-till for 10 years, but we may change our protocol slightly in the future to sequester more carbon, and you'll have to follow those too if you want to keep getting paid. One other thing I want to mention here is what we call additionality. So in these soil carbon contracts, what companies are really looking for is additional carbon storage. So the problem here is if you've been no-tilling and cover cropping for 10 years, you're not going to get a huge benefit. You're not going to see an enormous amount of additional carbon stored in the soil. At least that's what I've been told. Don't take my word for it. Unlike those conversions from one type of farming to another. So these contracts usually have an additionality component to them where they want to see some additional carbon stored, right? Some additional work done, something different than has been done in the past. And so unfortunately, I think this penalizes people who have been doing the practices that these companies are really looking for and have been looking for quite some time now. So the next thing is data collection. After you do the farming, after you do no-till cover cropping, you have to show the company that you did this. And so there are all sorts of data collection requirements in these contracts. You have to submit data and they are able to verify, yes, this farmer did actually plant cover crops. This farmer did follow our protocol. And this is one reason why a lot of the companies that you see offering to pay for carbon credits are the data collection companies. So companies that already have pretty robust data collection tools out there, like Bayer has obviously the Climate Corporation, and that's one. They already have quite a few users, right? So it's a lot easier to tackle this part of the problem than it is for a company that's never collected data from anyone. Um, let's go ahead and go to the next slide. Then once these companies collect the data, the next thing they need to do is make sure that it complies with the protocols that they have established for these farmers. And so there is a verification step in here where the third party, not the broker, someone else is able to say, yes, this was the proper way to create a carbon credit for this farmer. And so based upon these 1,000 acres, all being no-till and cover crop, we've determined that there are so many carbon credits available for this farmer. So the verification is what happens next. And then once we've verified this, you would, in theory, be able to sell this carbon credit up the supply chain. But before we get to the sale of the carbon credits, I want to talk about stacking. If you have, let's say, 80 acres, right, and you sign up for one of these companies' carbon credit or carbon sequestration programs, in theory, you could also sign up with another company and another company and another company, right? So if each company is willing to pay you $10 per acre to do no-till and cover cropping, right, you could make way more money if you sign up with multiple different companies. Each one's going to pay you $10 versus just signing up with a single company. Now, the problem there is that, of course, the amount of carbon sequestered isn't multiplied each time that you sign up with a new program. And so each of these contracts will have some sort of what I call prohibition on stacking. So you can't stack the contracts on top of each other. You have to pick one and go with it. But oddly enough, there isn't a centralized storage database of who all has signed up for these, right? Because these companies aren't going to tell everyone else who they have signed up in their programs. They're going to keep that information proprietary. And so there isn't really a good way for one company to know if a farmer has signed up with another company for that same enrolled land or not. They have to take the farmer's word for it. So at least right now, there is an opportunity for fraud right here. And hopefully we don't see that in this marketplace, because that could really undercut it and hurt people. But there will always be some some that will, I'm sure, push the limits here, and hopefully that doesn't ruin it for everyone else. But when we get to the end of the process here now, right, the farmer's done the work, it's been verified, and the broker can say this farmer has generated 10 carbon credits, right? And then the broker can sell those to McDonald's or PepsiCo or whoever it is that wants to buy the carbon credits, the carbon offsets. So they can then tell their shareholders, we reduced our emissions by paying this farmer to put more carbon in the soil. I liken this to what I call environmental cryptocurrency. If you're familiar with Bitcoin or Ethereum or any of these cryptocurrencies, right, the way that it works is someone has designed a protocol, and if you can unlock the protocol, if you can have a computer do what it needs to do, I'm not a computer scientist either, to unlock the protocol and come up with a key, you can generate a Bitcoin, right? And then that Bitcoin is worth money to others who want to buy it. So in that instance, right, the person who's doing the mining to create this Bitcoin is a lot like the farmer here. You're doing the work to create the carbon credit. And the broker is just like the app that you might use on your phone to sell a Bitcoin that you have bought or that you have generated or you've created. And the buyer would be whoever wants to buy that Bitcoin. And so it's much like cryptocurrency. It's just, I call it environmental cryptocurrency. But, just like cryptocurrency, the whole system works on trust, right? So as long as everybody believes it, it works. If you start to have fraud or you start to find out, oh, there's another way to generate these carbon credits, outside of this, these protocols that have been created, you could have a loss of trust in this system. So the whole system works on trust. But a carbon credit, just like a Bitcoin, doesn't really exist. It's a fictitious creature, you could say. It's not a tangible object, in spite of all the pictures we see of Bitcoins here on the screen. All right, so let me wrap up here with some concluding thoughts about these soil carbon contracts. Um, Here are just a few things to think about if you're being asked to sign one of these and you're seriously considering it. One thing is that, farmers will often ask, if I sell the property, what happens to this program that I've signed up for, that I've enrolled these acres in? And for the most part, unless you have somehow convinced the buyer to also sign up or continue this program, the land may not continue in that program. And so if companies aren't recording these in your chain of title, they aren't necessarily going to automatically pass to a new buyer or of that land. So there may be a way to get out of it if you really want to, by just selling the land. But it also means that if you sign up for one of these for 10 years and in 5 years you decide you want to sell land, you could still do that. That's not going to be a problem. And you can tell your buyer, hey, you should continue this program and you'll get paid to do these things. But there's no guarantee, of course, right? Because they don't have a contract with one of these brokers. I also caution people, make sure that the data collection is limited, because I've talked a lot about data collection before in other topics with Hoosier Ag Today and others. There's a lot of concerns there with how much data companies collect from farmers. So just be careful, make sure you understand what it is they're asking for. And, are they asking for data that they don't need to verify carbon credits, that they want for something else? So, they can sell you more inputs or whatever it may be. I also think about additionality, and this is something that as an ag industry, we need to start talking about with the people in Washington, and make sure that, farmers who are doing these protocols already, who have been doing no-till and cover cropping for years, that they can participate in these programs, because it's not like you're being asked to plant your farm to trees and they're automatically going to be there for 20 or 30 or 40 years, right? It's not like that at all. Every year a farmer makes a decision, what am I going to do on this land this year? And so I feel like that is a decision that's made every year and should be recognized by these companies as something that people can or cannot do every year, right? So just because you've done no-till for 10 years doesn't mean that you're going to do it next year. And so you shouldn't be punished, you shouldn't be kept out of these programs because you've made that decision in the past to do no-till. No stacking, we talked about that. That's important to know and keep in mind, because once you pick one of these companies, you're locked in with them for 5 or 10 years. So make sure that you pick a partner here that you are comfortable working with. Who should you pick? I always think, if there's one of these companies that you already do business with and you have a long relationship with and you like them and they're offering one of these programs, seems like that's the easiest route to go, because you already know them and you trust them, versus someone you don't know at all. What's the downside to signing up with one of these? The biggest downside that I see is that you are foreclosing potential other opportunities down the road. What are those? No one knows right now, right? So who knows? So last but not least, should you sign up with one of these soil carbon contract companies? And I always tell people, as lawyers, we give legal advice. We do not give business advice. So I can't tell you what the right answer is here. It could be yes, could be no. It could be, maybe I'll just wait another year or two. If you wait, maybe the programs change. Maybe they get more lucrative. Maybe they get less lucrative. We don't really know. So there's a risk there. But if you sign up, there's not a huge downside if you're going to undertake some of these, or you're willing to undertake some of these protocols. So, it's a business decision more than anything, and something you can make smartly. Feel free to ask a lawyer if you have questions. These are long-term commitments, so it is going to tie up your land for a number of years, but that doesn't mean that it's a bad thing, and it certainly can be a very good thing for your farm. So I'm going to end there. Just say if you enjoyed this presentation or you want to know more, feel free to hop over to our website, aglaw.us. Hopefully you can remember that. But I tend to write a lot of articles about these sort of topics on ag tech and ag technologies that are improving the environment. And so you can find more at aglaw.us as well as my contact information. So I look forward to hearing from you all in the future, and I very much appreciate being here today. Thank you.
And Todd, we actually have a few moments. If anyone out here has any questions for Todd, please feel free to raise your hand. There we go, right here in front. I'll bring the mic to you.
On the measurement side of things, are we actually measuring practices performed, or are you actually trying to measure carbon?
So yeah, that's a great question. I think it probably varies somewhat from program to program. Some are paying you just to do the practices, right? So then the measurement is separate, and they worry about the measurement. In others, you might get paid only based upon how much is measured different in the soil. But ultimately, it comes down to the measurable difference in the soil. I think if you're doing these practices, it's not making any difference. At some point, no one's going to pay you for that, right? But at least initially, I think some of these, they do pay just to do the practices, regardless of the outcomes. They're taking the risk that there will be a benefit.
Anyone else with questions for Todd? We've got one over here. You should have grabbed me, Danica. I was just over there.
Uh-oh, Danica.
Just pull on my coat jacket next time, okay? Here we go.
My question is, if a farmer doesn't actually own the land, but is the one that's going to be doing the practices, does the agreement need to be between the landowner and the broker, or the actual farmer and the broker?
Yeah, that's another great question. And I think it really varies from contract to contract. Some may require you be the landowner, but others, if the farmer's the one doing the work, and let's say a farmer has a 10-year lease, they want to sign up for one of these, it seems like the farmer ought to be able to do that because they can guarantee they're going to keep farming this and they're going to do these programs for 10 years. So I think it's definitely possible that the tenant farmer could do these. But in most instances, it seems like it would be a landowner who would sign up and then pass those requirements down to their cash renter, whoever it may be.
We've got another question here in the back, Todd.
All right.
Back this way.
Good morning. So if you sign up for one of these, as you've looked at some of these contracts, what have you seen as far as if you change your mind year 2, 3, and just like, this isn't working for me? So you get paid every year, I'm assuming, something. Is there typically a financial penalty if you decide that you don't want to do it anymore? How's that work?
Some of these we don't yet know because I don't think they've finalized their terms. But in others, they may, for example, delay some of the payment till year 5 or 10, right? Or those later years. And that way, if you bail out, they have the right to not pay you. Others that I think may front load the contracts, you have to look and see, is there some sort of clawback provision that, you might have to pay some of the money back if you don't follow through for 10 years.
Todd, we've got another question over here to your right.
When we're talking the carbon credit market, are we looking mostly at cropland, or has there been any expansion into like other agricultural places like pasture, woodlots, things like that?
Yeah, absolutely. In the grazing side, there's been a lot of work here too. And I know there are contracts out there in western states for ranchers who can sign up, 10,000 acres at a time. And the idea there is that they are very strict about rotational grazing. So rather than let the cattle graze the grass all the way down to where it might be bare soil and you might have more carbon dioxide being released to the atmosphere, you keep the cattle moving, and that way, there's more vegetation on the land, more carbon being sunk into the soil for the long term. But yeah, there's absolutely programs out there for grazers, ranchers, grazers, whatever you want to call them.
Any other questions for Todd?
Yeah, Todd, you talked about the 1 metric ton being the standard unit. Do you have a rough idea if we're like a typical traditional crop farmer, but we go to no-till and all this, about how many acres does it take to generate that 1 metric ton, and about how much could the farmer expect to receive off of that 1 metric ton credit?
Unfortunately, I don't know the answer to the first question, so ask your soil scientist that. But the second question, I did recently get an idea of like what is a carbon credit worth. So I bought a airline ticket to Raleigh, Durham, North Carolina, where I'm going in January. And when I got to the last screen, American Airlines said, "Do you want to buy a carbon offset for your flight?" And so I thought, oh, this is interesting, right? Right on topic. And so I clicked on it, and it said that my flights from Indianapolis to Raleigh, Durham, and back would generate about 1.9 metric tons of CO2. So you figure about 2 carbon credits worth. And that to offset that, it was $7.60 per metric ton for me to pay if I wanted to offset my carbon impact for flying to Raleigh and back. So $7.60 is what I would have to pay for that carbon credit. So I guess figure out how's that trickle down to the farmer, right? Of course, the farmer only gets a little bit of that, but it's a good measure. And that could change quite a bit, right? It is a fluctuating market.
And you did decide to do that instead of check another bag, right?
No comment.
Okay. Okay. Any other questions for Todd? Todd, how do folks get in touch with you if they need more information?
Go to aglaw.us on the web. That's the best way to do it.
Very good. Ladies and gentlemen, Todd Janzen, let's give him a round of applause.
Thank you.
Thanks very much, Todd. Appreciate it. Again, thank you for being here at the Indiana Farm Equipment and Technology Expo. We hope you don't go anywhere. We've got a great seminar lineup today coming up here in just a little while, 10:30, the Soil Health Podcast. I have some soil health veterans that will be up here talking about some of these practices that, Todd was just talking about, how we can get into this, maybe some best practices for getting into some of the no-till, strip-till, cover crops. So that'll be coming up here in just a little while. And again, Dan Quinn and Sean Castile will be coming up at noon today. And I'd love for you to just hit them with questions. That'd be great. So we'll be back here in a little while on the seminar stage from the Indiana Farm Equipment and Technology Expo. Thank you.